There is a trained mechanic sitting in a hangar at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He has the tools, he has the certification, he has 15 years working on Black Hawks, and he is staring at a diagnostic screen he is not allowed to touch. Not because he lacks the skill, because a software company in Massachusetts charges $40,000 for the license to run it. A 2017 Government Accountability Office report confirmed it. The U.S. Army was paying private contractors for repairs. Its own people were trained, certified, and ready to perform. Stay with me, because this is not just a military story. That $40,000 number didn't come from nowhere. It came from a procurement system that changed quietly in the 1980s, one contract clause at a time, until the most powerful military on Earth found itself in the same position as a farmer in Iowa who can't reset his own tractor's computer without calling the dealer. The mechanism is identical, the logic is identical, and the people who built that system understood exactly what they were doing. Let's go back to the hangar, because the specifics matter here. A Black Hawk helicopter is not a mystery to the people who maintain one. The mechanics who work on these machines know them the way a good machinist knows a lathe he's run for 20 years. They know which seals fail first in cold weather. They know which hydraulic lines to check after a hard landing. They know the sound the tail rotor makes when something is about to go wrong before the instrument panel catches up. The knowledge is real, the training is certified. The experience is earned through years of hard work in cold hangars at 5 in the morning. None of that is in question. What's in question is the software. Modern military helicopters run on onboard computer systems that monitor everything: engine temperature, rotor balance, fuel flow, sensor performance. To diagnose a problem, you plug in, you run a diagnostic. The system talks to you in a language, and that language tells you what's wrong. You've seen the same idea at the dealership when your truck throws a check engine light. The mechanic plugs in a tool, the computer talks, the problem is identified. Simple concept, been around for decades, but here's where it changes. The language those military systems speak is proprietary. It belongs to the original equipment manufacturer, Boeing, Sikorsky, Lockheed, and the software that translates that language, the program that turns the helicopter's computer signals into plain readable diagnostics, is not sold to the Army. It is licensed per session, per contractor visit, through a third-party architecture managed by companies most Americans have never heard of. One of them is called PTC Inc., Massachusetts-based, founded 1985. Their product, called Windchill, manages the technical data and product lifecycle infrastructure for multiple U.S. military aviation platforms. The Army doesn't own Windchill, it pays to access it. And PTC didn't end up at the center of military aviation maintenance by being the best option available. They ended up there because the procurement system was quietly redesigned over 30 years to make exactly that kind of arrangement not just possible, but structurally guaranteed. Here is the part nobody tells you. Before 1984, this wasn't how it worked. When the government bought a weapons system, a vehicle, an aircraft, a piece of field equipment, the contract required the manufacturer to hand over a full technical data package, complete schematics, source code, repair manuals, maintenance procedures written clearly enough that the government could maintain, modify, and independently service the system without ever going back to the manufacturer. It wasn't optional. It was a contractual requirement built directly into defense procurement law, because the people who wrote those contracts understood something that should be obvious. You cannot fight a war with machines you cannot fix. That requirement didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it threatened the contractor's business model. The 1984 Defense Procurement Reform Act opened the door. Not all at once, not dramatically. The door cracked open. Manufacturers began successfully arguing that full technical data disclosure undermined their intellectual property. The software, the architecture, the proprietary systems embedded inside these machines represented decades of private investment. Handing it all to the government meant potentially exposing it to competitors. The argument had legal teeth, and Congress, deep into an era of deregulation and pro-industry procurement thinking, let those teeth bite. By the early 1990s, limited rights data packages had become standard. The government got enough to operate the equipment, not always enough to repair it independently, not enough to rebuild it, and not increasingly enough to run a basic diagnostic without calling the people who originally built the machine. The Defense Science Board raised the alarm more than once. Internal military voices went on record in the 1990s warning that growing contractor dependency in maintenance was not a theoretical risk. It was a documented, predictable consequence of the procurement direction already underway. Those warnings were formal, they were filed, they were acknowledged, and then they were set aside. Not ignored by accident, set aside on purpose. Think about what that means. The most expensive military in human history, operating the most technically sophisticated aircraft ever built, was being systematically steered through procurement reform, through intellectual property law, through carefully worded contract language, into a position where its own trained mechanics could not always fix its own machines, and the people writing those contracts knew it. The report said so in plain English. The Defense Science Board said so. The contracts kept being written the same way regardless. Now here is a number I want you to hold: $32 billion. That is roughly what the Army spent on aviation maintenance contracts over a 5-year period before the 2017 GAO report landed. $32 billion. Not on new helicopters, on maintaining the ones already in service, on contractor visits, contractor licenses, contractor-controlled diagnostic runs, and contractor-managed repairs that Army mechanics, already on payroll, already trained, already standing in the hangar with the tools in their hands, could have performed themselves if the software had been theirs to use. Hold that number. It gets worse. In 2019, a journalist embedded with a maintenance unit at Fort Campbell wrote a short piece for Task and Purpose. It didn't get much attention outside military circles. But in it, a mechanic described the situation exactly. He had physically accessed the component. He had visually identified the fault. He could have written the repair procedure from memory without cracking a manual. What he did not have was the proprietary dongle, a small hardware key issued exclusively through the OEM contractor, required to authorize the diagnostic software on that platform. Without the dongle, the software locked. Without the confirmed software diagnostic, the repair could not be officially certified. The helicopter sat. The contractor was called, flown in, logged, billed. Not because the mechanic didn't know what was wrong, because a piece of software said he wasn't allowed to know officially. That same year, Army aviation readiness rates for certain fleets dropped below 50%. More than half the helicopters in some units were not mission ready. Official explanations pointed to aging airframes, budget pressures, stretched parts supply chains. All of that was real. But sitting inside those readiness numbers was a maintenance bottleneck that 3 decades of contract lawyers and software licensing agreements had carefully, methodically constructed. And here is where this story stops being just about helicopters. In 1998, Congress passed a law that took the contractor's argument, the idea that software embedded in a machine you own can still legally belong to someone else, and turned it into federal statute, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Section 1201, it made it a federal offense to circumvent a software lock, even on a machine you purchased outright, even on a machine sitting in your own hangar, even when the only reason that lock exists is to make sure you keep paying the manufacturer for access to your own equipment. The U.S. military discovered this problem through helicopters. The American farmer discovered it through tractors. In 2015, John Deere explicitly cited DMCA Section 1201 in a federal proceeding to argue that farmers who purchased their tractors did not, in any meaningful legal sense, own them. You bought the machine, you did not buy the right to repair it. That was not a fringe legal theory. It was filed with the Library of Congress. And this is the moment where I need you to hold on, because there is a document, not classified, not restricted, sitting right now in a public archive on the Department of Defense and Inspector General's website, that reframes everything we've covered so far. It was published in 2020. It contains a number that makes the $40,000 software license look like a rounding error. And what happened after that report was published tells you everything you need to know about how this system actually works. Because a report that documents the truth in plain language and then gets acknowledged and shelved without action isn't evidence that the system failed. It's evidence that the system worked exactly as designed. The mechanic at Fort Campbell wasn't staring at a locked screen because the technology was too complicated for him. He wasn't locked out because he couldn't be trusted. He was locked out because that lock, legal, contractual, federally protected, was worth more to certain people than any single helicopter it was attached to. And somebody made very sure it stayed that way. That document landed in 2020 with almost no fanfare. No press conference, no congressional hearing, no segment on the evening news. It was titled, Assessment of the Department of Defense's Use of Contractor Logistic Support, published by the DoD Inspector General. Report number DoD 2020-048, and it is available right now to anyone with an internet connection and enough patience to look for it. What it said was not ambiguous. The Pentagon estimated it could save between $5 and $10 billion annually, every single year, if it recovered technical data rights for just its 10 most maintenance-intensive platforms. Not all platforms, 10 of them. $5 to $10 billion a year, sitting on the table, documented in a government report, signed and published and filed. Nothing changed. No legislation followed. No procurement reform was triggered. No contract renegotiation was mandated. The report was acknowledged, entered into the record, and the contracts kept running exactly as before. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a system is working as designed rather than failing by accident, that is what it looks like. The proof arrives, the proof is accepted, and the proof changes nothing. This is why that number matters. Not the $40,000, not even the $32 billion. The $5 to $10 billion annually that the government's own Inspector General said was recoverable, and that stayed unrecovered anyway. That is the number that tells you this was never about efficiency. It was never about the best way to maintain a helicopter fleet. It was about who controlled the access and who got paid every time that access was needed. Now let's talk about PTC Inc., because this is the piece most people skip past. PTC is not a household name. They do not run Super Bowl ads. They are not the company you call when your laptop breaks. They are an enterprise software company, and their products are embedded in the operational and maintenance architecture of military systems, commercial aviation platforms, and industrial manufacturing lines across the United States and Europe. Windchill, their flagship product, manages what is called product lifecycle data, the technical information that describes how a complex machine is built, how it operates, and how it is supposed to be maintained. When a military maintenance unit needs to access a technical manual, cross-reference a parts specification, or log a repair against an official data record, they are often working inside a system that PTC built and that PTC, not the government, controls the terms of. This is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. And it is an extraordinarily profitable one precisely because the alternative, the government owned ADA outright, was legislated away so gradually that most people never noticed it happening. Here is a name that connects the civilian and military sides of this story in a way that should make any working man uncomfortable. Kyle Wiens, not a politician, not a general, an engineer who in 2003 co-founded a company called iFixit, an open-source repair documentation platform that grew directly out of his frustration that manufacturers were withholding the basic technical information needed to repair the products people already owned. Wiens became one of the most persistent voices in the right to repair movement, testifying before state legislatures, filing comments with the Copyright Office, documenting case after case where the DMCA was being used not to protect creative work, which is what it was written for, but to protect repair monopolies. What Wiens identified in consumer electronics and farm equipment was the exact same architecture the Defense Science Board had warned about in military procurement. The mechanism was identical. The legal scaffolding was identical. The beneficiaries were different companies, but the logic was the same. Embed software in the machine, own the software separately, and anyone who needs to interact with the machine has to come through you. And here is the detail that ties it together. The DMCA was signed in 1998, 14 years after the 1984 procurement reform cracked open the door for limited rights data packages in defense contracts. The defense contractors got there first. They worked out the architecture inside military procurement before it had a name in consumer law. By the time the DMCA gave that architecture federal statutory protection across the broader economy, the model had already been stress tested and proven inside the largest procurement system on Earth, the U.S. Military was not a victim of a trend that started in consumer technology. The U.S. military was the prototype. Stay with me because this is where it comes back to you. In 2021, President Biden signed an executive order directing the Federal Trade Commission to address anti-competitive repair restrictions. Broad strokes, limited enforcement mechanism, but the direction was clear. The political cost of ignoring right to repair had finally grown large enough to register. In 2022, Colorado passed the first state-level agricultural right to repair law, requiring manufacturers to provide farmers with the diagnostic tools and documentation needed to service their own equipment. Not a favor, a legal requirement. In 2023, John Deere signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the American Farm Bureau, promising, though not legally guaranteeing, broader repair access for its customers. Notice what just happened there. A company that in 2015 argued in a federal proceeding that farmers did not own their own tractors signed a document in 2023 promising to be nicer about it. That is not a victory. That is a company reading the political weather and making the minimum concession necessary to slow the legislative momentum. The lock is still there. The software is still proprietary. The DMCA is still on the books. What changed is that enough people got angry enough that the company decided a voluntary handshake was cheaper than a binding law. On the military side, the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act included language directing the Department of Defense to improve its technical data acquisition practices, to push harder in future contracts for government data rights that the 1984 reform had allowed manufacturers to erode. The language was real. The implementation has been slow. The contractors who have spent 40 years building the current architecture have more lawyers, more lobbyists, and more contract history on their side than any single NDAA provision can overcome quickly. But the direction is shifting. That matters. Here is what this means for the man in his garage, in his shop, on his property. Right to repair laws now exist in multiple states and are expanding. Before your next equipment purchase, tractor, truck, power tool, diagnostic device, it is worth knowing whether your state has passed protections that give you legal access to the repair documentation and diagnostic tools for what you buy. That information exists, and it is findable. The iFixit database alone contains free repair documentation for thousands of products that manufacturers would prefer you pay them to service. Independent repair networks, local shops, co-ops, community tool libraries, are rebuilding the kind of practical knowledge infrastructure that existed before the software lock made the dealer visit mandatory. The mechanic at Fort Campbell knows how to fix the helicopter. He has always known. What he needs is the legal and technical right to do what his hands and his training already make him capable of doing. That is not a radical idea. That is how repair worked for the entire history of mechanical civilization before 1984 opened the door and 1998 locked it shut behind us. And here is the number that closes this story. The DoD Inspector General report said $5 to $10 billion a year, recoverable, documented, sitting there. That report was published in 2020. It is now years later. Do the math on what has not been saved. Do the math on what has continued to be paid out to contractors for access to data the government could have owned, for diagnostics the mechanics could have run, for repairs the Army's own people were trained and ready to perform. That money did not vanish. It went somewhere. It went to the companies that spent 30 years making sure the lock stayed on the door. The mechanic at Fort Campbell is still there. The tools are still in his hands. The helicopter is still in the hangar, and somewhere in Massachusetts, the software is still waiting for someone to pay for the license to tell him what he already knows. That is not a coincidence. That is infrastructure. The person watching this video is the kind of person who noticed that something about this didn't add up. You noticed the number before the explanation landed. You noticed the name before the role became clear. You noticed that the warnings came 30 years ago, and the contracts kept getting written the same way anyway. That is not an accident of attention. That is the kind of mind that these systems were built, hoping would stay distracted. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Drop it in the comments because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever been told you needed a dealer, a contractor, or a certified technician to run a diagnostic or perform a repair on something you already owned outright? A truck, a tractor, a piece of shop equipment, a medical device, because those stories add up. And the people writing the next round of right to repairs legislation need to know that the guy in the garage is paying attention. Hit subscribe so it finds you when it drops. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it is the only way to make sure you are in the room when the next piece of this lands.